Hello and welcome. Thank you everyone for joining us for the gentle art of saying no with John Kerr. My name is Matt Carlson and I'm a security analyst here at Consensus. I will be the moderator for today's session. DEMOFEST is presented by Consensus. Transform how you sell with Consensus, the first product experience platform. Automate demos, drive faster decisions, and accelerate growth. You can learn more at goconsensus.com or click Watch a Demo at the top of your screen. We encourage you to participate in today's session. You can find a few ways to engage with us on the right side of your console. The chat function will allow you to connect with us as well as other attendees. You can find some helpful resources in the Docs tab, including a document on this session specifically called The Gentle Art of Saying No. And lastly, your speaker will answer any questions at the end of the session. So please ask your questions at any time through the Q&A box. If at any time you're having technical difficulties, head to the gear icon at the bottom of your screen. This is where you'll see a help document to troubleshoot common issues. And now I would like to introduce our speaker, John Kerr. John is the Managing Director of Mastering Technical Sales, a company dedicated to improving pre-sales engineers' professional skills and capabilities around the world. And with that, I will turn the time over to you, John.
Great, thanks, Matt. And now we'll see how well this screen share actually works, right? Okay, entire screen. And there we go. Wonderful. All right. So should I ask the required, can you see my screen question, or are we good, Matt? So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the gentle art of saying no. You might think this has nothing to do with demos, and you're kind of half right, but also it's a very important skill leading up to giving the most appropriate demo. So what we're going to spend about the next 45, 50 minutes on is looking at no. Now, this is not a negative workshop because sales thrives on a can-do, let's get it done attitude. It's more an issue about teaching you the most appropriate way to work with not just salespeople, but your boss and customers and other people within the organization itself. It's based on a class that we teach called MTS 406S, which is actually one of our leadership classes, which is teaching leaders how to say no as part of our curriculum. So that's part of the Mastering Technical Sales curriculum. You see up there the obligatory QR code, and that'll take you to our website where you can find out way more information about our training, our workshops, and so on. But anyway, onto the stuff that you're really here to hear about. No. Three key points we're going to cover today. One is we're going to look at the psychology of why you say no and what happens when you actually hear a no. Secondly, when and why we should say no, at least in our professional lives. Don't try too much of this in your personal life back home. It may not necessarily go that well. And then third, and that'll be the meat of the presentation, is tips and techniques about how to say no. Down here at the bottom, you'll see a little quote from Pythagoras. He's the triangle guy. The oldest and shortest words, yes and no, are the ones which require the most thought. So keep that in mind as we go through. Also, as we go through the session, you'll see a number of these like insight or quotes from people around the world relating to no. And this one I love. This is Tony Blair, the former Prime Minister of the UK about 15, 20 years ago, saying the art of leadership is saying no and not saying yes. It is very easy to say yes. Now, politicians are also always criticized for saying yes to everything. They also tend to use a lot of words to say not very much at all. But I think these are pretty relevant words from Tony. So let's get to the problem statement itself. So here's the problem statement. We're sales engineers, and it's as simple as that. That means we have certain behaviors. One is we love to fix things. Secondly, we really like to please people and make people happy. And do remember, it's not your job to make the salesperson happy. It's your job to make the salesperson successful. And third, we have many stakeholders throughout the organization. I like to say that SEs are the oil, the glue that makes everything run together within a company. So that means because of those behaviors, we're mostly driven to say yes instead of no. We are the organization of last resort. If no one else will do something to help the customer, then we will do it. All right. You see my T-shirt here. Trust your SC. Right. So that's kind of our mantra. So what this really comes down to is this. Number of surveys out there from organizations say that approximately 30% of SE time is spent on unqualified activities. And instinctively, we could blame salespeople, and that's not actually the case. A lot of that is driven by customers and by our bad behavior, by the behavior of our managers, but 30%. So imagine the productivity gains if you can just take that 30%, cut it in half, take it down to 15%. If you're an SE director or VP and you have a 100-person organization, that's like getting 15 more people working for you. So let's kind of go through this in terms of how we can start saying no and dig down into some of those unqualified activities that, at least in our minds, are a waste of time. So no is a very emotive word. So I decided to go do some research and speak to industry experts. One of the industry experts you see here, this is my 3-year-old granddaughter, Riley. Riley has mastered the art of saying no. So I kind of take her example. And the reason that Riley tends to say no is it's about control. And it makes her feel safe because she's making no commitment to do something. And remarkably, as you take that on and carry that on into adulthood, the same things happen. So let's see. So let's go to exercise number 1 now. Actually, before we do the exercise, anybody recognize the movie reference here? So in the chat, anybody know what this movie is and why it's relevant to this workshop? Let's see what you come up with. Anybody? All right, there we go. Dr. No, that is indeed true. James Bond, 1964. This guy, Dr. No, is actually Joseph Weissman. And Sean Connery was Bond, and Ursula Andress, famous for emerging out of the surf in her bikini, was the lady. So now in the chat, just tell me, how do you feel when you personally receive a no and you wanted a yes? How does that make you feel? What's the psychology? What's the emotions behind it? Because this is important. So in the chat, how do you feel when you get a no and you really wanted a yes? So let's see what we come up with. Right, so Erica's disappointed, annoyed, disappointed, but also it's a challenge, right? Jennifer's frustrated, right? Frustrated. Jennifer thinks she didn't do a good enough job, unhappy. Yeah, Tim wants to know why, and sometimes you don't get the why. So kind of frustration and disappointment runs through it. So when you're in the position of saying no, that's certainly something that you want to bear in mind is the person on the other end, if you like, the receiving end of this is going to feel that way. So that's exercise 1, kind of valuable. So now let's flip it around and we'll go to exercise 2. So we're continuing the Bond theme here, just because this is one of my favorite scenes. How do you feel when you personally give a no to somebody else? Right? How does that make you feel? Okay. Now, my 3-year-old granddaughter, it makes her feel in control, but how does it make you feel? So when you say no, guilty. All right. Erica's just summed up the entire SE persona right there in that one word. Anxious, rude. Right. Oh, helpless. Okay. What else we got? Anybody else input? Okay, it depends on who or what. If it's not a friend, I don't feel bad at all. Yeah, there's definitely a difference between receiving or saying no in a personal setting and in a professional setting. If you get a no from family or friends, it's kind of emotional and you feel that maybe you've done something wrong. Where in business, it can be a little more negative and kind of sets, boundaries, if you like. You know, the example I cite is I grew up as a working class kid at a little fishing village in England. So I certainly heard no a lot from my parents because there were things I wanted that we just couldn't get. But they were amazing parents nonetheless. So, everything goes into context there. And that kind of brings up a little bit of cultural things as well. I noticed in some of the messages earlier, there are people on this workshop from all over the world, and welcome. I saw India, Japan, Singapore, a bunch of people from Europe and so on. So let's understand that saying no and handling disagreements certainly has a lot of cultural aspects, and let's kind of leave it as that. And rather than get myself in trouble, I thought I would use a recognized expert in the field, and that is this lady, Erin Meyer. So Erin, gosh, about 10 years ago now, wrote a book called The Culture Map. If you have not read it, I would strongly recommend that you do. You work in multicultural environments, and it looks, the way that different cultures have different behavioral traits. The two we're looking at here in terms of handling disagreements is, there's one group of cultures, let's say, that tends to get confrontational for agreements and others that avoid them. Now, if you look at me personally, my dad was English, so smack here in the middle. My mom was German, so kind of on the a little more direct and confrontational. So I certainly had, an interesting childhood in dealing with the two of those. Yet I now live in the US, and our corporate headquarters of Marketing Technical Sales and Up to Speed, our master holding company, is actually in Singapore. So I'm now spanning about 65% of this handling disagreements spectrum. So you might think if you are way over on the right-hand side somewhere, Japan, Thailand, Ghana, you say, we just don't say no. And I kind of challenge you on that is actually, yes, you have to. Many of you work for a US company or a UK company, and you have to deal with people in corporate headquarters somewhere in Silicon Valley, for example. They have a different personality type than you. So it is important that you learn how to say no and how to deal with people who are outside your culture. That's critical. So again, I would highly recommend this book from Erin. I think it is required reading for anybody who operates outside the span. So let's kind of start moving actually into saying no itself. So saying no or yes, we have to recognize is actually a subset of full-blown negotiation. And you kind of have to look at it as that. And there are certain negotiation tactics that you can apply to saying no. So what is it that most successful negotiators do? So quick review about successful negotiation before we get into actually how you say no. So the first thing is they actually spend more time thinking about the other party's interests than their own. Hopefully you know your own, right? You understand why you want to do something or you don't want to do something. You may not necessarily understand why the other group wants to do it. In the SC world, this is kind of a bit like discovery. So understanding why somebody wants to take a certain course of action is pretty important and why it's important to them. Secondly, you have to understand that people do not always make decisions rationally, even in business. We've certainly experienced irrational people in our personal lives. I'm sure everybody could say that. But it's even true in business. And there's an old truism that most experienced salespeople will say is that when people will buy emotionally, then they'll defend their decision with logic afterwards. So don't always assume that people are rational or vote with their pocketbooks or their wallets, as they like to say here in the US now. 3 is, they might think about the bigger picture, in terms of what are some of the other issues that are at stake and not just regard it as a one-on-one thing. Number 4 is, you want to be tough on the problem, but you want to be gentle on the relationship. I mean, you need to work with these people again and again and again and again. And then number 5, particularly if you are in a position of power or authority, or you have leverage, you do want to make sure that you're not diminishing the other person, and you need to give them opportunity to save face or retain dignity, particularly if they're on one of those cultures from the right hand side of Erin's chart. Face and dignity is critically important. But I would say if you pulled one thing out of that above all, it is to maintain the relationship. Even if you are in the position of saying no to somebody, you still need to make sure that you're going to be maintaining the relationship, and that is critical. And what it really comes to is a little bit of insight here. The most effective listening actually happens when you shut your mouth and you open up your brain. And you'll discover, if you haven't already, that the whole art of negotiation, the art of saying no, has a lot of similarities with doing discovery with your clients. Is sometimes the best thing you can do is ask a question and then shut up and listen very hard. One of my favorite sayings is that sales engineers are not paid by the word. And we need to remember that, not just when we are spewing out features, but when you're actually speaking and negotiating with people as well. So I love this quote from Sukant here. And Andy says, 2 ears, but only 1 mouth, something my grandmother in Germany used to remind her grandchildren about all the time too. Okay, so that was part 1. That was about psychology and saying, hearing a no. And the reason, just to recap, that's so important is we do need to understand how a no or a yes makes us feel and the other person feel, because we need to adapt to that. So secondly, just quickly, now let's look at when and why we should say no. So let's go to exercise 3 now, and I'm just going to put something here in the meeting so we know there's a break. So exercise 3. In the chat, let's just do this in our professional lives, and I put a few examples up here. What are some of the most common reasons in business as an SE or an SE leader or a subject matter expert, whatever we might be, that you actually say no? Right? So what do you got? Why do you most commonly say no? Okay, so Yelena is too busy, but she had time to type this in, so thank you. What else we got? Why do you say no? Technology gap, yes. It's outside my scope, right? Yeah. It's unqualified, right? A product can't do it, to paraphrase Steve. Other reasons you might say no. All right, not enough time. Fear, yes. Unethical, right? That's an important one, Erica. Yeah. Not going to be valuable, right? Also a waste of time, says Rebecca. Not a good fit for me, right? Bad fit. Right, so 2 bad fits. All right, anything else from anyone? Not enough information to make a decision. Yeah, we're sales engineers. We always need more information. Okay, a few people like that one. All right, so not enough information to make a decision. So now I threw some examples at the bottom here, but let's take a different look. So these are what I call the easy no's. And these are actually listed on the summary sheet that we have as well. So it might be something, for example, that is unethical. A couple of people mentioned that. It could be something that you're doing that's not in the customer's interests. The sales engineer in general is the person that the customer trusts the most and says provides the most value once they're going through the sales process by a ratio of 2 or 2.5 to 1 over the salesperson and even the executives in your company. So you are, in effect, the technical conscience of the sales force in your company in general. You're over 100% capacity. You just can't do it. It's something that's going to impact your health or your family. That's important too. It's not your brand. It's not, if you're a leader, it's not your team's brand. This relates back to what some other people said about fit. It's either not a product fit or it's not a fit for your particular skill sets, and you may need to be able to explain that. So these are what I need to call the easy no's, and these are the ones that we should actually feel pretty comfortable in making. Unfortunately, not everything fits into these 7 or 8 buckets, but these are some ones that you can actually use to get started. Certainly be careful about the unethical one. You need to be very, very sure about saying that before you push back on that, because there are certainly ramifications that go with that nowadays. So watch out for that one. And next, executive insight. I couldn't actually find who said this, so I just attributed this to the universe. But this has been one of my favorite quotes throughout the last 20 years. I'll let you read it yourself. What this means is sometimes something's just not a good fit for you, for your team, your organization, your product, even for the customer. So the sound of your feet actually walking away from it is actually a fantastic thing to hear. So kind of keep that as well. Many people call this the rule of 2 feet. If you're in a meeting and you're not getting anything useful out of it, you're not contributing, then get on your 2 feet and walk out. All right. So now let's get into the real heart, the meat of the workshop itself, saying no. And do remember that no is a complete sentence, probably the shortest complete sentence that you can come up with. So we're going to look at 3 different scenarios. Scenario 1 is going to be dealing with salespeople and saying no to salespeople. Scenario 2 is going to be dealing with the customer or a prospect and saying no to them. And then scenario 3 is a quick look at dealing with your boss, not in terms of saying no to your boss, but how to make sure that your boss does not turn one of your no's into a yes behind your back. And so that's the 3 scenarios that we're going to look at. And please, if you've got some input on these in the chat or stories, chip in on the chat. So let's look at salespeople. So salespeople are persistent, they're persuasive, they're paid to get a yes, or we can add a 4th P up here, which is professional. And they're also used to hearing no. And this is all good. Because we really want our salespeople to act this way. It's what we pay them to do, or the company pays them to do. This means that when you're in a discussion about doing something, normally the salespeople have an advantage as they are just better at selling and getting their way than you are as an engineer. Now, the implication here is not that salespeople are terrible and we need to constantly be saying no to them. That is not the case. And in fact, I got to say, just as a side note, I've been surprised about some of the remarks that a couple of speakers have made about salespeople today, kind of like vilifying them. Salespeople are not villains. They are your partner in business, and they need you to be successful and you need them to be successful. And it's kind of a bit like a marriage. So you need to accept that. So let's look at a few ways of saying no to salespeople. And Tim says, this SE says no, they just complain. So let's look at some ways that maybe you can pre-handle or deal with that complaint, Tim. Right, so we're going to look at actually 4 tips. I'm going to break my rule of 3. Tip 1 is prioritization. And this is when you need to set a limit on time, people, or money. And it's actually very identical to if you're in discovery and you're dealing with a whole bunch of issues that a customer might have, and you ask them to prioritize, and they say, oh, they're all important. So we have a situation here. And the sales rep says, I have 3 demos for you next week. Tim, I'll pick on you because you were the last one who put something in the chat. So Tim says, ha, great. Yeah, I've only got time to prepare for 2 of them. Right? So typical response might be, but I promised a demo to all 3 customers. Right? So where do you go from here? Yeah. So recommended response is something, a bit of praise, right? A bit of empathy. Sounds like you're busy. Which are the top 2? Right? And the rep's a rep, they're not going to give in. I promise we've got to do all 3 of them. Okay. So your response back is, yeah, I can't do that. It seems like we're overextended. Which one should I prepare for first? Then, this is really important. You be quiet and you listen. And what you're trying to do is to get the salesperson, or if you're in discovery, the customer, to tell you what is their number 1 priority. And from there, you can go forward and rinse and repeat. But what you're doing is forcing prioritization from the salesperson. And I have never, ever had this fail. Sales rep always have one deal that's more important than some of the others. So what you're trying to do is to, again, push them into prioritization. This also works well with anybody who's got making demands on your time itself. It's asking them to prioritize if they give you a bunch of different tasks. So that's tactical forcing tip number 1, which is prioritization. Tactical forcing tip number 2 is using data over emotion. Now, I learned this the hard way. When I first became an SE manager, I went along to a QBR, the dreaded quarterly business review, and I just got steamrolled. There were a bunch of sales managers in there, and there were things they wanted to do that I didn't think were a good idea, but they were just way better at selling their ideas than I was. And it was a skill set I didn't have that I had to pick up and learn pretty quickly. So what I learned is I need to capitalize on my strengths. I'm an engineer, so I can utilize data. Because if you're competing against emotion, which is, my people tell me, it seems, it feels like, I'm told, you usually can't compete in that same arena as effectively as many of the salespeople can. Some of you will, but you can use data. So here's how. Rep says, we need to complete all 4 of these RFPs by the deadline. Reminder, RFP stands for really fast paperwork, by the way. So you say, again, a little bit of empathy. Wow, fantastic way to build up your pipeline. That's awesome. Of those 4 RFPs, which ones did we know about beforehand and actually have a little bit of input into? And the rep says, 2 of them, Merck and Glaxo, dealing with pharmaceuticals. Okay. So your response is, okay, so let's complete those 2, and the other 2 we'll pass on or we'll defer our response. Now, the rep is going to say, we got to do all 4. Okay. So this is then you then come back with data, and I'm actually using some real life data here. Our data shows we've got a 24% success rate for known RFPs versus a 6% success rate for random RFPs. Okay. So the odds are 4 times in our favor if we complete the Merck and Glaxo RFPs than in the 2 random ones that came in. So let's focus on those 2 first and see what happens. So that's an example of using data over emotion. And it can be very effective. What it does mean, though, as an SE, is you kind of need to know your stuff. What's the difference between a success rate on a qualified demo versus an unqualified demo, POCs, RFPs. So any activity that's going to be a time sink for you, you should understand where and when your time should be applied in that. So that's tactical forcing tip number 2. So let's move on to number 3. So number 3 is, I call this invoking higher powers. And this is really pushing it up the food chain, the management chain. Now, you need to be careful about doing this, and you need to use it sparingly, but it becomes very effective when there is conflict, for example, for your time, when you have two salespeople or two organizations asking for the same chunk of your time. So, for example, you're asked to do something, and it's going to be a considerable use of your time. You might say something like, did Robin, who's the sales leader in this case, clear this? Okay. The rep says no, right? So your response is, it's a significant investment of our time, right? Not my time, but our time, people or money, that they should take a look, as they may need to prioritize this. So this is pushing it back to the sales leader. Alternatively, you could do it this way. I'll need to confirm with Anuja, who's the SE leader on this. All right. And the rep looks at you and does the old, you can't just say yes. And you repeat the same thing. It's a significant enough investment of our time, people, or money that they should take a look, as they may need to prioritize or confirm with Robin, back to the sales leader. So what you're doing is you are pushing it up the ladder. Now, it's pretty certain, like 80% of this time, that the salesperson or the people who are asking for your time are going to escalate it as well. So you can, if you've got a bit of a relationship with the person, handle that, or at least work with it beforehand. If you're familiar with negotiation techniques, it's called the accusation audit. And you might say something like, it seems you're probably going to be unhappy with this decision, and you're thinking about escalating it up the management chain, the food chain. Is that something you really want to do? And just kind of leave it as that. Okay? So that's tactical forcing tip number 3. And then forcing tip number 4, and this is kind of a little bit of wordplay, is using a couple of magic words called if or unless. So, for example, the salesperson says, can we start the Cirrus Corp proof of concept next Monday? It's urgent. Actually, it might be your boss asking you this as well. And you can have 2 different responses. You can say no, unless we can push back the cumulonimbus POC by 10 days. I was having cloud fun here. Or alternatively, and this plays better in about 80% of the cultures around the world, you start with a yes, actually, and you say, yes, if we could push back the cumulonimbus POC by 10 days. So what effectively you're doing here is you are making a trade or bartering for time, activity, time, people, money. So those are the 4 forcing tips. So you're looking at prioritization, which is absolutely one of my favorites, using data over emotion, invoking higher powers, and then use of the word if or unless, doing bartering. So that's 4 ways of getting to know, or at least getting to a better position when you are dealing with salespeople or anyone else who's making these demands on your time. So, salespeople. Let's do scenario 2 now, dealing with customers. And many of the same rules apply. So we'll look at some nuances around it. So how do we say no to customers? So as much as we as sales engineers dislike saying no to the salespeople that we work with, we hate even more saying no to customers. That's just a terrible thing for us to do. And many SEs will try and defer that to the sales rep and make them the baddie in this situation and have them say no, even if that no is owned by you and not by the salesperson. And if it is your no, I personally think you want to own it. It does actually increase your credibility in your relationship with the customer. A little bit of great advice here from Paolo. Don't say maybe if you want to say no. Maybe is a horrible word for a customer to hear. It's neither a yes nor a no, or even a weak yes. So if you want to say no, you should actually say no itself. So there's a rule 0, which is that one. If you know the answer is no, but you defer and you say something like, let me ask my boss, or let me ask the project manager, or let me defer that over to the sales rep. And this tends to do way more harm than good with the relationship with the customer. It shows that you're unable to persuade other people, maybe your company doesn't care, and that you have absolutely zero authority within the company whatsoever. So really doesn't position you in terms of credibility or intimacy if you're looking at it from the trusted advisor point of view. So don't defer. If you know the answer is no, then own the no and actually say it. Rule 1, be calm and be confident. This is blatantly obvious, but you should still do it. So don't apologize. In most cultures, there's a few ways you should do that. Don't look down, don't look apologetic, but do be kind and be direct. So don't dance around the no. If it's a no, actually say no as if it's the final answer. And having been an executive on the other side of the table, a CIO and a VP of IT who's bought from dozens, if not hundreds of vendors, I can tell you this is very much appreciated. A no is sometimes something that is actually fairly easy to deal with from an executive point of view. Rule 2, a little bit of play, and this is kind of more the Anglo-Saxon languages. Try and use won't instead of can't. I actually noticed I used can't in one of the examples earlier, so I broke my own rule. Someone's bound to point that out. There's a bunch of engineers on the call. So use won't when possible. If you say we can't do that, that's usually not true. And the example is, actually, let's use this one, right? I'm on a diet. Someone offers me ice cream. I say, oh, can't possibly eat that. That's not true. I could eat it. I'm not allergic to ice cream. In fact, I'd probably love to eat the ice cream. It's more, I won't eat it because I don't want to take in the calories and then have to swim for an extra 20 or 30 minutes or another 2 games of pickleball or whatever else. So if there is a way for you to use won't, and it's true, instead of can't, you should certainly do that. It's more of a psychological answer, but still very appropriate, and helps finalize things. And then rule 3 is often you have to explain why a yes might be bad. Now, this is a situation where you need to be brief, but you need to be accurate, to don't dance around the scenes. And what you'll discover is agreeing to absolutely everything that a customer might ask you creates problems. Now, you do have to set boundaries, right? It's like dealing with my 3-year-old and my 6-year-old granddaughter. You have to set boundaries. You have to say no sometimes, but you need a reason for the no, or a no and yet, unless, or a yes if. There's an example here. To honor that request means scheduling a bunch of different partners, and that's going to cause all kinds of quality control issues. We won't do anything to jeopardize the timeline of going live. I had a situation about 3 weeks ago when a client wanted to radically change the location, the number of people, the content of a workshop, and the number of facilitators who was going. And it was just way too late to do it at the last minute. So we had to have a full and frank discussion about what we could do and what we couldn't do. And we actually came to a very nice resolution because of it. And I actually started off with, if I said yes, here's what I believe would happen, and here's why that is bad. And I don't think you want to hear me say yes. As I said, it was a very full and frank discussion, but we got to a great place in the end. So you do need to explain why a yes is bad. So if you kind of summarize the 3 customer techniques, this is where we go. So rule 0 is don't defer and say, let me ask someone else unless you truly have to. If you know the answer is no, then the answer is no. Do stay calm, pleasant, and confident, and that is what the client wants from you, especially if you're a subject matter expert. Tend towards using won't instead of can't, if it's true. And then 3, explain why a yes is bad. And again, at the bottom, much like dealing with salespeople, once you say something, always pause and listen. The power of silence is something amazing in negotiation as a whole, but particularly when you deliver a yes or a no. So sometimes when you say no, or you explain something, or you ask somebody a question about something, as SEs, we want to jump in and we want to fill the void, and we shouldn't do that. We just need to shut up and listen, and active listening. And it's a really, really hard thing for us to do. All right, last bit. Let's talk about dealing with the boss. Now, as I said, this is not how to say no to your boss. There are many resources out there that will teach you how to do that. And there's a few examples in the front sheet that we hand out that goes with this. This is more about making sure that you have the conversation with your boss, or even your boss's boss sometimes, to make sure that they don't turn one of your no's into a yes behind the scenes and undermine you. And so I call this setting ground rules. For those of you outside the United States, ground rules is an American sports term that is just local rules that happen. What happens if it's a football game and somebody kicks the ball and it hits a drone flying above? So that's a ground rule. And really, the biggest ground rule is that you should walk a mile, or 1.6 kilometers for everybody else, in their shoes, and understand what it is that you want and what it is that your boss wants. And you'll discover there's a lot of commonality. And whether you are an Academy SE who's just been in with the company for a few months, or you are the super principal SE, the distinguished sales engineer who's been with the company for 20 years, you still have a boss that you need to work with and answer to. And if you haven't had this discussion, I would strongly, strongly encourage you to have this discussion. So if you think about it, what are your basic needs? Right? You want someone who's going to have your back and support you. You want someone who's not going to make major commitments of your time, or if you're a first-line manager, your team's time. You want someone who's not going to surprise you. You want someone who's going to provide proactive air cover for you and your team. And you probably want someone who's going to act in your best interest. What your boss wants is they don't want to be surprised, right? Very much the same as you. They don't want to be embarrassed. Most bosses only want that to be involved when absolutely necessary. So you kind of keep them in the loop to a minimal extent. Your boss probably doesn't want you to provoke conflict. And your boss certainly should want you to look good, because that actually makes them look good as well. So it's reflected glory. So as I said, this is a conversation that you need to have with your boss, because sometimes you're going to say no and it's going to get escalated. And that's not a bad thing. It's the way that companies work. When my kids were younger, I would sometimes say no, and they'd escalate to my lovely wife, Allison. And she had the ultimate say in a lot of the child raising things. So it happens in personal life as well. But you do need to have this conversation with your boss to understand how to make sure that a no does not get turned to a yes behind the scenes, or if it does, what that process is actually going to be. Super essential that you do that. So let's recap. You can be a good person with a kind heart and still say no. We talked about the psychology of saying and hearing a no, control. It makes many of you disappointed and frustrated and upset even to receive a no. Many people don't feel that way, though. They regard the no as a bit of a challenge or an obstacle or an objection to overcome, particularly if they're more sales oriented. Secondly, when and why you should actually say no. So we got a list of 7 or 8 easy no's where you're really not going to get too much pushback if you do that. And then lastly, we just looked at some tips and techniques about how you can actually say no. And we looked at it from 3 different aspects. We looked at it from saying no to salespeople, we looked at it from saying no to customers, and then we looked at it in terms of dealing with your boss to make sure that your no stays a no itself. Now, one last thought before I go and we get into the Q&A, and please put any questions you might have for me into the Q&A. If you say no and you are dealing with what I'll call an experienced practitioner, so someone who's been around for a while, and if they know what they're doing, so they've got good sales or good management, good leadership experience, and they hear a no, what they're going to do to you is they're going to ask a question, follow exactly the same advice that I've just given you. They're going to ask you a question, and then they're going to shut up and listen very carefully. Right? So I've kind of Yoda-ized this, but what they're going to say is the English version of, determined with that no you are. I can't do Yoda. Tell me more, you must. So what they're doing is they're asking you to explain your feelings, your emotions, and even your rationale behind saying no. And they'll ask this question, then they'll shut up. Okay? So take that as a good thing, because it means they're trying to understand your position. Now, it also means they're trying to gather information in order to potentially convince you that your no should become a yes. But if you are dealing with somebody who does this, you should take it as a good sign. And you should do the same thing when someone says no to you, is you put on your discovery hat and you try and gather as much information as you can to ascertain why you should be saying no. And before we get to the questions, I'll leave you with what I call the nuclear option here. So this is one of my favorite quotes. I've been using it for, I don't know, like 30 years or so to date myself. And I wanted to attribute it to somebody else. Like I'm pretty convinced I borrowed it from somebody, but I was doing some searching and I couldn't find it. But anybody who's ever worked with me for more than a few days has probably heard me say this. And it's only by saying no that I can get all my yeses done. So quite often when I'm trying to explain to somebody why I've said no, I actually use this phrase. I'll say, it's only by saying no that I can go and get all the other yeses done that I've given to other people, including maybe you. And very frequently people will just kind of step back and they'll go, oh, and that's it. That's all I have to do. So I kind of call this the nuclear option. So I've probably given away some of my trade secrets now, but that's it. So, folks, that was a quick trip through the gentle art of saying no. But again, the what's in it for me is, that 30% of time that's wasted on unqualified activities. And it's not just the fault of the salesperson, it's your fault. Some of it isn't anyone's fault, the customer, just infrastructure itself. But quite often by learning how to say no, you can give yourself and your company more time so that you can work on the things that are really important. So it doesn't matter how good your demos are. If you can't do adequate discovery and you can't figure out how to say no to things that you shouldn't be doing, you may not get in the situation where you can go and deliver that perfect demo. That is the art of saying no. So that is it. Matt, if you want to come back on board and let's see if we have any questions.
All right. No questions just yet, but I have one if you don't mind.
I do. Actually, Curtis just put one into the chat. Curtis says, is it a customer or a prospect? It makes a difference. And Curtis, yes, you are right. You can be a little more direct with a customer, particularly if you built a relationship with them, than a prospect. But if a prospect is kind of leading you somewhere where it's just not a good fit, or they're trying to do an unlimited POC or get demo equipment loaned to them and it's just not appropriate, you can say no to them as well. You just tread with a little more caution, I would say. Matt.
Yeah. Do you have, I don't know how to phrase it, but a quiver killer no phrase, like that go-to way of saying no when you're in a situation, one that kind of works for any and all?
Well, I run my own business. I've been doing this for many, many years, so I can just say no and it's done because I'm the boss. But I do love that phrase I finish with, which is, it's only by saying no I can get all my yeses done. And that is often my rationale for saying no. I have, however many hours in the week that I can focus on doing important things. And that is my killer is, I've already got a whole bunch of yeses lined up for things I'm going to do this week. I'd love to take on your project. In the document that is in the Docs tab, there are a few references to internet articles that give you 50 ways to say no and 16 ways to say no to your boss. And some of those are a little clickbaity, but some of them are actually very good. So I would certainly recommend reading through the reference materials that I provided. All right, we have any others?
Oh, here we go. Steve's got one in the Q&A. Do you have any thoughts on how to handle a question which may have been prompted by a competitor as a trap?
Oh, yes. So quite often, so one is, except in a very, very few cultures, you never want to knock the competition. So I will quite often respond to that is, that's something we've heard quite often. We've heard this a few times, particularly when people have been looking through a number of products within the industry, and then take it from there. The reverse of that is somebody might ask a question like, why are you better than your competition? And I would normally say, I'm not an expert on the competition. I really don't want to go there. What I can tell you, though, share with you, is the top 3 reasons why people buy from us rather than from the competition. And if that's of interest to you, I can tell you what our customers say. And then you just pick 3 things that you can do that the other guys and gals can't. And so, that's my preferred mechanism of dealing with that kind of question is, you pivot back to your strengths as opposed to trying to deal with what the competition says.
Beautiful.
Right.
Any other questions?
Any others? I know we're at the end of the day. I should get brownie points for giving everybody 7 minutes back on their day then. Woo.
Oh, here we go. Atul has one that's in the chat here. It is evident that having clarity is important to say yes or no. Do you have any suggestion in those type of situations where it's a gray area with yes and no?
The clarity. So normally this depends on, so gaining clarity is a matter of questioning technique. So what I tend to use is a mixture of questions. So quick review, there's closed-ended questions, which give you a yes or a no. Do you have a data center in Amsterdam? And much as people hate closed-ended questions, they can be really important and give you useful information. The classic is, are you allergic to seafood? Right? The second one is an open-ended question, which promotes conversation. And the third one is what I call a non-question question, which is where you might say something like, "Ooh, tell me more. Wow, that's interesting. Never heard it explained that way." So by using a mix of those 3 types of questions, that's how I try and gather information back from the other person without it sounding like an interrogation. Specifically to Atul's question, sometimes you are in maybe land and there's not always a yes or a no. What your customer does want to hear, though, is what you're thinking. So I might say, Atul, based on the information that you have shared with me, I'm about 75% confident that we can do X. I will follow up with you in the next 48 hours and double confirm that or not.
All right, that might be the end of our questions.
Okay, well, in that case, I will wish everybody a very happy Tuesday afternoon from beautiful Longboat Key, Florida, and enjoy the rest of DEMOFEST. And if anybody offers you a drink tonight or a really nice meal, say yes, don't say no.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much, John. That was awesome. As a former SE, I felt like you were talking right to me. Um, as we begin to wrap up the session and the day, I would like to share a few reminders and announcements. Don't forget to stop by the virtual expo hall to visit our premier partners who have gone above and beyond to contribute to making this event a success for all of you. And don't forget to check out our raffle giveaway. Information on how to enter, as well as the live leaderboard, can be found pinned at the top of the public chat, as well as the docs tab. And don't forget to grab that Art of Saying No document from the document tab in this session as well. We're excited to be bringing DEMOFEST on the road again this year as DEMOFEST X. We had a great time in San Francisco this past February, and we can't wait to bring the event to New York City and London again later this year. You can register to join us at demofest.com or find a link in the Docs tab. And thank you all for joining us for this session, and thank you, John, for the valuable insight and knowledge. This concludes day one of DEMOFEST. Please join us tomorrow, starting at 10 a.m. Eastern, for another full day of great sessions. We'll be kicking off day two with some of the consensus leadership team and our product keynote. Thanks again, and we'll see you soon.